The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site in Comuna 13, one of Medellin's steepest and most neglected hillside neighborhoods, where houses clung to mountainsides at angles that defied both gravity and municipal building codes. The rhythmic pounding of jackhammers against concrete echoed through the narrow valleys between the ramshackle houses built from corrugated metal sheets, recycled wooden planks, and optimism, creating a symphony of progress that had been absent from these streets for decades. Diesel fumes from cement mixers blended with the perpetual mountain mist, while the shouts of construction workers in regional accents from across Antioquia mixed with the excited voices of children who had never seen heavy machinery operating in their neighborhood. Experience the untold story of how Pablo Escobar built a legal empire that would make him more dangerous than any drug lord. Subscribe for the shocking conclusion in Part 3. Pablo Escobar stood at the edge of the wooden platform overlooking the excavation site, his leather boots thick with concrete dust and red mountain clay, watching as his crew poured the foundation for what would become a 12-unit apartment complex designed specifically for families who had been living in single-room shacks for generations. The year was 1981, and the man who had once been offered control of Colombia's most lucrative cocaine empire was now studying engineering blueprints in the pre-dawn darkness, calculating load-bearing requirements for buildings that would be constructed on mountainsides, where engineers said nothing should be built. His reflective construction vest, worn over a simple white cotton shirt that had already absorbed the morning sweat, marked him as just another supervisor on a job site that attracted attention throughout the valley for its impossible ambition. The cement trucks navigating the impossible mountain roads represented more than construction equipment. They were symbols of Pablo's fundamental rejection of the path that had made his former associates wealthy beyond imagination. 3 years had passed since Pablo made the decision that shocked the Colombian underworld, walking away from Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha's offer to join what would become the Medellin cartel, an opportunity that promised immediate access to billions in cocaine profits and control over international drug trafficking routes. While his former associates were building fortunes measured in billions through white powder that disappeared into American cities, Pablo was building something different, something visible, something permanent that couldn't be destroyed by a single DEA raid or rival cartel war. His construction and infrastructure company, Escobar Construcciones, had grown from a single imported Caterpillar bulldozer, purchased with borrowed money, to a fleet of 60 vehicles and equipment pieces representing nearly $2 million in legitimate assets, concrete mixers from Germany, earth-moving equipment from Japan, generators from the United States, and specialized mountain construction machinery from Switzerland. Every piece had been imported through proper channels, with complete documentation that passed through Colombian customs offices, paid full import duties, and generated tax receipts that were carefully filed in accounting ledgers that could withstand scrutiny from any government auditor. But the true measure of Pablo's transformation wasn't visible in accounting books or equipment inventories. It was carved into the mountainsides of Medellin in the form of concrete staircases, retaining walls, drainage systems, and apartment buildings that had fundamentally altered how poor families lived in one of South America's most challenging urban environments. Every morning brought new evidence of his empire's impact. Children walking to school on paved paths instead of muddy trails, elderly residents accessing medical clinics without risking dangerous climbs, and families living in concrete structures with electricity and running water instead of improvised shelters that collapse during rainy season. But legitimacy in 1980s Colombia was never as simple as it appeared on carefully typed government forms or notarized business contracts. The country's shadow economy operated through a complex web of relationships, favors, and strategic omissions that transformed every business transaction into a delicate negotiation between official procedures and practical necessities. Pablo's morning routine began at 5:30, not in a glass-walled boardroom or legal office decorated with law degrees and government certifications, but walking the muddy paths between construction sites, greeting workers by their first names and the names of their children, discussing family problems that extended far beyond employment issues, and listening to complaints about delayed materials, insufficient wages, and the constant fear that government officials might suddenly decide to investigate their documentation status. By 7, he would be in his Ford pickup truck, a deliberately modest vehicle that could navigate mountain roads without attracting the attention that luxury vehicles would generate, navigating the treacherous mountain roads that connected hillside neighborhoods to the downtown offices where the real business of empire building took place. This was not the empire building of guns or threats that dominated newspaper headlines, but the more subtle and ultimately more dangerous empire of contracts, permits, zoning variances, and carefully orchestrated meetings with men who wore conservative suits instead of bulletproof vests, carried briefcases instead of weapons, and wielded government stamps and signatures instead of violence. The complexity of Pablo's daily navigation between construction sites and government offices revealed the fundamental challenge of building legitimate power in a country where legitimacy itself was a fluid concept. Each construction project required dozens of permits from multiple government agencies. Each permit required relationships with officials who operated under formal procedures and informal expectations. And each relationship required a careful balance of professional respect, community benefit demonstration, and strategic financial arrangements that fell within the gray areas of Colombian business culture. The Banco de Occidente branch on Calle 50, housed in a colonial-era building with thick walls that muffled the street noise and iron-barred windows that filtered the morning light into geometric patterns across marble floors, had become Pablo's second home and his introduction to the sophisticated corruption that lubricated Colombia's legitimate economy. Every Tuesday at 9 sharp, after navigating through the bank's security checkpoint and formal reception area, he would sit across a polished mahogany desk from Luis Hernandez, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed glasses who managed the commercial lending department and lived in constant fear that his carefully constructed career might be destroyed by a single, inappropriate financial decision. Hernandez had initially been suspicious of this young entrepreneur, who seemed to have unlimited access to cash for equipment purchases, whose business plans involved constructing infrastructure in neighborhoods that other contractors considered commercially impossible, and whose community development projects generated no obvious revenue streams. 3 years of on-time payments, expanding business relationships, and demonstration of genuine community impact had transformed that initial suspicion into something approaching reverence, but also into something approaching dependency that made Hernandez uncomfortable during his sleepless nights, when he wondered whether he fully understood the sources of Pablo's financial stability. Pablo never arrived at these meetings empty-handed, but his offerings revealed the sophisticated understanding he had developed of Colombia's shadow economy during his transition from street criminal to legitimate businessman. There were never crude bundles of cash that could be interpreted as bribes. Those were too dangerous for a man building a legal empire and too insulting for a banking professional who maintained his self-respect through careful adherence to official procedures. Instead, there were consultation fees paid to Hernandez's wife for community development planning services she provided through her social work background, processing expedites that helped the bank meet quarterly lending targets that determined Hernandez's annual bonuses, and appreciation gifts that included family vacation opportunities, children's private school tuition assistance, and home improvement loans at preferential rates that fell just within the gray areas of Colombian banking regulations. The conversations in Hernandez's smoke-filled office, where afternoon sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, creating patterns of light and shadow across financial documents scattered across the mahogany desk, revealed Pablo's true genius for understanding and manipulating the intersection between legitimate business development and political influence. While other contractors competed for municipal projects through lowest bid processes that often resulted in corner cutting, delayed completion, and community dissatisfaction, Pablo was creating projects that municipalities didn't even know they needed. Infrastructure developments that solved problems before government officials had scheduled committee meetings to discuss them. His intelligence network, built during his years navigating the street-level economy where information about police movements, rival gang territories, and business opportunities represented the difference between success and imprisonment, had evolved into a sophisticated information-gathering operation that identified every neighborhood leader, every community complaint filed with municipal offices, every municipal planning meeting, and every political relationship that influenced government decision-making processes. The network included former police officers who understood government bureaucracy, social workers who attended community meetings, church officials who heard confessions and concerns, and small business owners who served as informal community centers where residents discussed their needs and frustrations. When residents of La Macarena submitted a formal petition to the municipal government complaining about the impossible trek to reach the main road during rainy season, a journey that required elderly residents to navigate steep, muddy trails that became dangerous rivers during afternoon downpours, Pablo's surveying crews were already measuring hillside gradients and calculating construction requirements, while municipal officials were still scheduling initial committee meetings to review the petition. When families in Santo Domingo Savio were forced to carry water up 300 vertical feet in plastic containers because municipal water systems had never been extended to hillside neighborhoods, Pablo's engineers were calculating pipeline routes and pressure requirements, while municipal officials were still determining which department had responsibility for infrastructure development in informal settlements. This intelligence network allowed Pablo to position himself not as a contractor competing for government projects, but as a community development partner who anticipated needs, solved problems, and generated results that made government officials appear effective and responsive to their constituents. The relationship was symbiotic. Pablo received community gratitude and political influence, while municipal officials received credit for infrastructure improvements they hadn't funded, planned, or managed. But Pablo understood that gratitude was a currency more valuable than Colombian pesos and infinitely more sustainable than the temporary highs of cocaine profits that had enriched his former associates while subjecting them to constant violence, government pursuit, and the psychological stress of operating illegal enterprises. Gratitude, once earned through genuine service, became a renewable resource that appreciated over time and influenced political relationships across multiple generations within the same families and communities. Every project began with the same carefully orchestrated community engagement process that Pablo had refined through 3 years of trial and error. A community meeting would be scheduled in a local school or church, spaces that carried symbolic authority and social comfort for residents who had learned to distrust government officials and outside businessmen who appeared in their neighborhoods with promises they rarely kept. Pablo would arrive not in expensive clothes or luxury vehicles that would emphasize his economic distance from community members, but in the same dust-covered work boots and simple cotton shirt he wore on construction sites, presenting himself as someone who understood physical labor and shared the practical concerns of families struggling with inadequate infrastructure. These meetings typically lasted 3 to 4 hours, during which Pablo would listen with patience that surprised community leaders accustomed to rushed presentations from government officials who had predetermined solutions for problems they didn't fully understand. Residents would describe their needs through personal stories. Elderly grandparents who hadn't been able to visit their families for months because they couldn't navigate steep trails. Children who missed school during rainy season because walking to school became dangerous. Families who rationed water because carrying it from distant sources was physically exhausting and time-consuming. Pablo's responses revealed the difference between his approach and traditional contractor relationships with communities. Instead of explaining why proposed solutions would be expensive, complicated, or impossible, he would ask detailed questions about daily routines, family priorities, and community dynamics that influenced how infrastructure improvements would actually be used. Instead of presenting predetermined plans that reflected his convenience or financial interests, he would sketch rough proposals on portable blackboards and ask for community input about design modifications, construction scheduling that minimized disruption to daily routines, and maintenance responsibilities that communities could realistically sustain. Then, usually within 2 to 3 weeks, rather than the months or years typical of municipal project development, construction equipment would begin appearing on streets that had never seen anything larger than donkey carts or human-powered wheelbarrows. The speed of project initiation created a psychological impact that reinforced Pablo's reputation for effectiveness, while demonstrating to communities that someone with real power was finally paying attention to their needs. The staircase project in Comuna 1 became the template for everything that followed, both as a demonstration of Pablo's construction capabilities and as a masterclass in community relationship building that would be studied and replicated throughout Medellin's hillside neighborhoods. 270 concrete steps, each precisely measured and reinforced with steel rebar imported from Brazilian steel mills, equipped with drainage systems designed by engineers who had studied mountain infrastructure in Switzerland and Austria, connecting the hilltop neighborhoods to the cable car system below that provided transportation access to downtown employment opportunities, medical facilities, and government services. The engineering challenges were immense. The hillside gradient required custom-designed retaining walls that could support concrete structures during earthquake activity and heavy rainfall that turned mountain slopes into mudslides. The logistics required helicopter transport of materials to locations inaccessible by road, coordinated with construction schedules that accommodated residents who needed to use existing trails during construction phases. The project cost $43,000, funded entirely through Escobar Construcciones with no municipal contracts or government oversight, representing a level of community investment that had never been seen in informal hillside settlements. But the engineering achievement was secondary to the social engineering that Pablo orchestrated around the construction process itself. Instead of hiring outside crews who would arrive, complete the work, and leave, Pablo hired residents from Comuna 1, providing employment opportunities and construction skills, training that created long-term economic benefits beyond the infrastructure improvement. Instead of rushing construction to minimize costs, he scheduled work phases that allowed community input and modifications, ensuring that the final product reflected community priorities rather than contractor convenience. The carefully orchestrated opening ceremony, planned with the attention to detail of a presidential inauguration, revealed Pablo's understanding that infrastructure projects created political impact far beyond their immediate practical benefits. Pablo walked every step alongside community leaders, children who had never been able to safely reach the cable car system, and elderly residents who had been trapped in their hillside homes during previous rainy seasons when existing trails became impassable rivers of mud and debris. Maria Elena Vasquez, a 68-year-old grandmother who had lived in Comuna 1 for 30 years and had watched her neighborhood transform from rural mountainside to dense urban settlement, grabbed Pablo's hand with weathered fingers that trembled with emotion as they reached the bottom step of the completed staircase. "Don Pablo," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, marked by decades of mountain wind and sun. "You have given us wings. My grandchildren can fly to school, fly to the doctor, fly to opportunities we never imagined possible." The photograph of that moment, published in El Colombiano newspaper 3 days later, above a feature article about community development in informal settlements, showed Pablo not as a powerful businessman commanding expensive projects or a former criminal seeking redemption, but as a neighbor, a community member, someone who understood that power built on gratitude and genuine service lasted longer and created deeper loyalty than power built on fear, manipulation, or temporary financial incentives. The image would be reproduced in campaign literature 3 years later, when Pablo decided that community development needed to be supplemented with direct political power. Yet every step forward in his legitimate empire required Pablo to navigate deeper into Colombia's shadow economy, where the line between legal and illegal became increasingly blurred. The Tuesday morning meetings with Luis Hernandez at Banco de Occidente gradually expanded to include other participants, municipal planning officials who needed consultation on zoning regulations, customs officers who could expedite equipment imports, and union leaders who could guarantee labor peace on sensitive projects. These expanded meetings took place in the bank's private conference room, a windowless space thick with cigarette smoke and quiet conversations about municipal budgets, construction permits, and community development priorities. Pablo's role in these discussions was never officially documented. He was simply a concerned businessman interested in community development, but his influence was unmistakable. When Councilman Eduardo Ramirez needed financing for a community center in his district, Pablo's company mysteriously received the construction contract at cost, requiring no profit margin. When Municipal Planning Director Carmen Ospina faced pressure to approve low-income housing developments, Pablo's architects provided detailed engineering studies free of charge, studies that inevitably supported the projects. The genius of Pablo's approach was that everyone involved could maintain the fiction that they were participating in legitimate business development. There were no bags of cash, no explicit threats, no drug money changing hands. At least not in any way that could be documented or prosecuted. Instead, there were consultation contracts, expediting fees, and community development partnerships that benefited everyone involved while gradually centralizing power in the hands of the man who had walked away from the cocaine empire. But not everyone in Medellin's construction industry welcomed Pablo's expanding influence. Traditional contractors who had operated through established networks of political connections and family relationships found themselves losing municipal contracts to this upstart who seemed to operate by different rules. Roberto Henao, whose family construction company had dominated hillside development for 2 decades, began spreading rumors that Pablo's financing came from illegal sources, that his community projects were merely fronts for money laundering operations. The confrontation came to a head during a Municipal Development Council meeting in October 1981, when Henao directly challenged Pablo's eligibility for city contracts. Where does a man with no construction background get the capital to outbid established companies? Henao demanded, his voice carrying across the packed council chamber. What community development organization can afford to build infrastructure projects at no profit? Pablo's response revealed the political sophistication he had developed during his 3 years of legitimate empire building. Standing slowly from his seat in the gallery, he addressed not Henao, but the community leaders and residents who packed the chamber. Mr. Henao asks where my financing comes from, Pablo said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. I invite him to visit Comuna 1 and ask Maria Elena Vasquez, who can now visit her daughter in the city center, because we built stairs. I invite him to visit Santo Domingo Savio and ask the mothers who no longer walk 3 hours for clean water, because we installed pipelines. I invite him to ask the children of La Macarena who attend school every day, because we built roads that don't disappear in the rain. The applause that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Pablo understood that he had made a dangerous enemy. Within weeks, Henao's equipment began experiencing mysterious mechanical failures. His suppliers reported sudden shortages of critical materials. His workers faced intimidation from unknown men who suggested they might find better employment opportunities with other companies. None of this could be directly traced to Pablo or his organization, but the message was unmistakable. The man building a legitimate empire still remembered the lessons of the streets. As 1982 approached, Pablo's daily routine had evolved into a complex orchestration of legitimate business development and shadow economy maneuvering. His mornings still began with construction site visits, but his afternoons increasingly involved meetings in nondescript offices throughout Medellin, conversations with men whose business cards identified them as consultants, facilitators, and municipal liaison specialists. These were the intermediaries who made Colombia's shadow economy function. Former police officers who understood permit processes, ex-military personnel who could guarantee security for sensitive projects, and political operatives who knew which officials needed financial support for their own community development initiatives. The most important of these relationships was with Captain Mauricio Vega, a recently retired national police officer who had spent 15 years working in Medellin's intelligence division. Vega's official title was security consultant for Escobar Construcciones, but his real value was in the detailed intelligence he provided about rival contractors, municipal officials, and the increasing presence of actual drug trafficking organizations in the city's construction industry. Pablo had walked away from the cocaine empire, but the cocaine empire was expanding into every sector of Medellin's economy, creating complications that his legitimate business empire couldn't ignore. The Ochoa family is moving money through housing developments in El Poblado, Vega reported during one of their weekly meetings in a small restaurant near the city center. They're offering to fund municipal projects at 50% below cost, which makes your community development work look expensive by comparison. Pablo listened carefully, understanding that his former associate's drug money was now competing directly with his legitimate business empire, threatening to undermine everything he had built through 3 years of careful community engagement. The solution, Pablo realized, required moving beyond community development into the realm of political power itself. His evening routine now included hours spent in his home office, studying municipal budgets, analyzing voting patterns in different neighborhoods, and mapping the complex relationships between community leaders, church officials, and elected politicians. The walls of his study were covered with detailed maps of Medellin's neighborhoods, marked with colored pins indicating completed projects, ongoing construction sites, and potential future development opportunities. But the most important documents were the voter registration lists and electoral data that Vega had obtained through his former police contacts. Pablo studied these pages with the intensity of a military strategist, understanding that each completed construction project had created dozens of grateful families, and that grateful families became loyal voters. Comuna 1 had 1,147 registered voters. Santo Domingo Savio had 2,234. La Macarena had 1,556. These weren't just neighborhoods where he had built infrastructure. They were electoral bases where his name was spoken with reverence in kitchens, discussed with approval in corner stores, and remembered with gratitude every time families walked on paved roads or climbed concrete stairs. The mathematical calculation was inescapable. With projects completed or underway in 18 different neighborhoods, Pablo's legitimate empire had directly improved the lives of nearly 30,000 residents. In Colombian municipal elections, where voter turnout rarely exceeded 40%, and victory margins often fell below 1,000 votes, 30,000 grateful residents represented more than a political base. They represented the foundation of real power. As 1982 drew to a close, Pablo's nights were increasingly spent alone in his study. The city of Medellin spread out below his hillside home like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. The maps on his walls had evolved from construction project tracking to something more ambitious, a detailed analysis of political districts, municipal council seats, and the complex web of relationships that determined who controlled public budgets, zoning decisions, and development priorities in Colombia's second-largest city. The decision crystallized during one of these solitary planning sessions, as Pablo studied the electoral data from the previous municipal election. The winning candidate for mayor had received 47,832 votes, a margin of victory of just 3,247 votes over his nearest competitor. Pablo's community development projects had directly benefited residents representing more than 8,000 potential votes. But the real opportunity lay in the municipal council races, where district seats could be won with as few as 1/200 votes. But political power would require a different kind of empire building than community development projects. It would require navigating Colombia's complex party system, building alliances with established political families, and presenting himself not as a former street criminal turned construction entrepreneur, but as a legitimate political candidate with a track record of community service. The transformation would be risky. Political candidates face scrutiny that businessmen could avoid, and his past would inevitably become a campaign issue. The phone call came at 11:30 on a December evening, as Pablo sat surrounded by electoral maps and voter registration data. Luis Hernandez from Banco de Occidente spoke in whispers, reporting that federal banking inspectors were asking questions about Pablo's financing sources, requesting documentation for equipment purchases and community development expenditures. "They're not accusing anyone of anything," Hernandez emphasized, "but they want to understand how a construction company can fund so many nonprofit projects." Pablo hung up the phone and walked to the window overlooking Medellin, understanding that his legitimate empire had grown large enough to attract attention from authorities beyond the local level. Federal scrutiny meant that pure business development would no longer be sufficient. He needed the protection that only political power could provide. Municipal councilmen weren't subject to banking investigations. Community development funded through municipal budgets didn't require private financing documentation. Political candidates had legal protections that businessmen lacked. The transformation was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Pablo Escobar, who had rejected the cocaine empire to build something legitimate, would now have to enter the most dangerous arena of all, Colombian politics. As he studied the city lights below, he understood that everything he had built through 3 years of community development, construction projects, and shadow economy maneuvering had been preparation for this moment. The man who had walked away from billions in drug profits was about to discover whether gratitude could be transformed into votes, whether community development could become political power, and whether legitimacy could survive the scrutiny of democracy itself. The construction empire had been the foundation. Politics would be the test.